Welcome, dear listener. In this quiet hour, let us drift back across the currents of time. Tonight's story isn't one of fables or fantasy, but of a world that once breathed, bled, and burned just like ours, though long buried under centuries of silence and stone. You are here not to rush or grasp, but to release and remember. So before we step into the echoing corridors of history, take a moment with me now. Close your eyes gently and take a slow breath in. Feel your lungs expand as you inhale through your nose, softly, and now let it all out through your mouth, again, slower this time. Inhale, hold, and exhale. As you breathe, watch the blank canvas behind your eyelids and allow imagination to paint what it sees. There's no effort here, only calm, only curiosity, only the soft hush of memory rising like mist over forgotten fields. Now, picture yourself standing at the edge of a sleepy village at the break of dawn. The air is heavy with dew. The earth smells damp and ancient. Smoke curls from quiet chimneys. The sky is still gray, neither night nor morning. A bell tolls from a crooked steeple in the distance, once, twice, slowly. But today, something's different. There's tension in the stillness, like the world itself is holding its breath. Somewhere, boots are tightened. Somewhere, blades are gripped. And in the hearts of men and women who have tilled soil all their lives, something ancient is stirring, not rage, not rebellion yet, but the first crack in the shell of obedience. You see, this is not merely a story of war or politics. It's a story of the human spirit strained to its edge, stretched across generations of hunger, shame, silence. What happens when people born to serve begin to wonder if they might deserve more? What happens when a shepherd looks upon his Lord and no longer sees a divine figure, but a man? A fallible man who eats and drinks and lies and fears? Across Europe, in countless villages bound by dirt roads and lordly decrees, the working class had long endured a quiet kind of violence. It wasn't always blood or bruises. Sometimes it was a whisper, a glance, a law written in ink they could not read. It was the tethering of lives to land they didn't own. It was watching your child cough to death while the manor windows glowed with feast light. It was knowing your daughter's purity might be taken for sport and that no justice would follow. But most of all, it was the knowing that none of it would change. That it was ordained. That this suffering was your place in the world. For centuries, that belief had held. But belief is fragile. And under enough pressure, it fractures. Tonight, we walk alongside those whose beliefs had finally broken. It didn't happen all at once. There were murmurs first, like wind stirring long dormant leaves. A priest quietly questioning why Christ wept for kings. A traveler from a neighboring village speaking of landlords who had fled. A boy caught with a scrap of parchment, outlawed words declaring that all men, all souls, are equal. And then came the taxes, absurd, relentless. Equal burdens demanded from those with nothing and those with everything. It was the final insult. A quiet man came home from the fields and stared at his blistered hands, and for the first time felt hatred. What follows in our story is not simply an uprising. It is not a war in the way we often picture war, armies in gleaming armor or great speeches before battle. No. What followed was a storm, grim and silent and unsparing. A reckoning so deeply personal that its violence shocked even the most brutal of the age. These were not trained killers. They were farmers, blacksmiths, shepherds, and yet, when they rose, their fury knew no limits. Because theirs was not a political campaign. It was a cry carved from generations of pain. A scream that had been stifled for too long. When the revolt began, it was not chaos. It was clarity. Those who had suffered knew exactly where to strike. They tore down the documents that had chained them, the contracts that named them serfs. They burned the estates not only out of hatred but out of necessity to send a message. That this land no longer belonged to those who did nothing. And when they came upon the clergy, the very shepherds who had told them to endure, to obey, to bless the lash, they showed no mercy. The rebels didn't just destroy property. They reversed roles. They forced nobles to serve them food. They made bishops renounce their vows. They paraded the powerful through the same streets where peasants had once been flogged for stealing bread. You may wonder, as you rest here, why it had to be so brutal. But understand, the violence was not mindless. It was method. It was memory turned inside out. It was justice refracted through generations of injustice. And yes, it was theatrical. Because the feudal system was a performance, and the peasants had learned to perform in return. They mocked the rituals of nobility, not out of jest but as declaration that the stage had changed, that the masks were off, that the audience now held the power. Even so, not every blow was struck with rage. Some were struck with eerie calm. A calm that comes only when one has nothing left to lose. A calm that terrifies even the bravest knight. This is not an easy tale. And as you continue to breathe slowly, feel your chest rise and fall, know that the stillness you sit in now was bought by many storms like this one. Their fury shaped the world you now call peaceful. So let us walk softly through the smoke and ash, not with fear, but with respect. Not with judgment, but understanding. As you inhale again, slowly now, let your mind release. Feel the tension in your jaw soften. Let your hands go limp. As you exhale, picture a distant field, empty, windswept, where once stood a manor house. Now only stones remain, and grass grows where whips once cracked. The memory is fading, but tonight we remember. We listen. We breathe. And we continue. The roads they walked were not unfamiliar. These rebels had traveled them all their lives, to market, to church, to the fields and back again. But never like this. Never with purpose woven into every footstep. Each village they passed through echoed with cautious hope. Old men watched from doorways. Mothers hid their children, not in fear of the rebels, but in fear that they, too, might be broken if this movement failed. Because for the first time in memory, there was a rumor carried not by noble decree or priestly chant, but by whisper, and wonder, and warning, that the people themselves might rewrite the world. Breathe in, and exhale softly. Imagine that road beneath your feet now. Stone and dust dew clinging to your boots. You walk not as a follower but as a witness. Around you, men and women carry no flags, no armor. Only tools turned to weapons, scythes and hammers, pitchforks and plows. And in their eyes, a deep and wordless determination. They do not speak of strategy. They do not need to. The pain they share is unspoken but absolute. What made these revolts so intense, so terrifying to those who ruled, was not just the suddenness, but the knowing. These peasants did not strike blindly. They struck precisely. With knowledge only lifelong servitude could give. They knew the back entrances to manor homes. They knew which barns held grain, which paths led to the steward's chamber. They knew who had beaten them, taxed them, shamed them. And they remembered. Yet the most powerful tool they carried wasn't made of iron or wood. It was memory. Memory made sharp by years of humiliation. Memory turned blade. The ruling class had never expected this. For generations, they believed the system they built was eternal. That peasants were too simple, too docile, too fractured to ever resist in unity. But unity had bloomed from shared silence. From the knowing nod across the field. From the bread given in secret. From the muttered prayer that someday something would break. And now it had. The nobility's first response was disbelief. Then panic. Castles once thought secure were fortified overnight. Guards were tripled. Letters sent in haste. But fear is a slow poison. And even the most fortified walls tremble when doubt seeps through the stone. Some nobles fled, abandoning their estates to the advancing tide of rebellion. Others tried to reason, to bargain, offering bread now, when before they offered only lashes. But it was too late. The people had learned that mercy was not freely given. It had to be taken. And so, the violence intensified. Not as wild chaos, but as ritual, a purging of pain long unspoken. Lords were not simply killed. They were humbled, stripped of their robes, forced to kneel before those they once whipped. Some were made to serve food to the hungry. Others paraded in rags through towns, their names mocked, their dignity erased. These were not acts of madness. They were performances. A new theater where the cast had changed and the script reversed. As you breathe in again, slowly now, let your imagination walk into one such village. The smoke rises from a great house, its wooden beams groaning in flame. In the square, a nobleman sits, trembling, his fine garments muddied and torn. Around him, the very people who once bowed now stand silent, not with rage, but with the quiet satisfaction of justice reclaimed. And in that silence, something shifts. This is not vengeance for one wrong. It is release for 1,000. You see, feudal society was not built on strength. It was built on belief. The belief that some were born above, others below. That this order was natural, divine. That to question it was to sin. But belief is fragile. And now, the peasants were teaching their masters what they had known for centuries, that when belief breaks, power follows. This is why the violence seemed so disproportionate. It was not just rebellion. It was revelation. And it had to be loud enough, brutal enough, lasting enough, to be remembered. Because the rebels knew they would not win forever. That their moment of power was fleeting. That armies would return and punishments would come. But they also knew this, that memories, once planted, cannot be uprooted. That somewhere, a child would hear of this day. That a song would be sung in secret. That a lord might never sleep soundly again. And that mattered. So they wrote their message not on paper, but in fire and blood and the trembling silence that followed. And all across the countryside, people watched. Some from windows. Some from behind barns. Some from the ruins of their own broken hearts. And they understood, maybe for the first time, that nothing was truly fixed. That kings can kneel. That power can crumble. That no crown is immune to rust. As you breathe now, let your thoughts become weightless. Let the sound of imagined wind drift over your mind like fog over an empty field. As you exhale, watch that field bloom not with crops, but with hope. Because beneath every act of destruction was a seed of renewal. Beneath every burned record, the chance to rewrite. Beneath every fallen tower, the possibility of a different world. It would not come easily. It might not come for centuries. But it had begun. And beginnings, even bloody ones, carry promise. So rest now. Let the past settle around you like a warm blanket. Let the echoes of those voices lull you, not with noise, but with knowing. Knowing that history is not only written by kings. That sometimes, the smallest voice, the voice that says, "No more," changes everything. Breathe in once more. Hold. And release. As you do, allow the tension in your chest to soften. Let your limbs grow heavier, your breath more steady. Feel the stillness returning. Let the story linger like embers, warm, glowing, fading. But never quite gone. And we'll continue. The wind had changed, and though no one spoke of it openly, everyone felt it. There was a different quality to the silence between footsteps, a new tension in the curve of the sky. In towns where once the peasants moved with downcast eyes and hunched backs, there were now heads lifted just slightly higher, gazes that lingered a moment too long, conversations that stopped when authority passed. It was subtle at first, like the scent of rain long before the storm. But for those who had ruled unquestioned, that scent was terrifying. Because it smelled like the end of obedience. As you lie here now, with each breath soft and steady, feel the calm settle over your body. Inhale slowly through your nose, hold gently, exhale through parted lips. Again. Let your breath loosen any weight in your shoulders, in your chest, in your thoughts. And as you drift deeper into this story, imagine the hearts of peasants beginning to beat not only with fear, but with something foreign and electric, possibility. The uprisings, when they finally surged forward, were not as sudden as they appeared to those above. They had been growing, inch by inch, behind hedgerows and in alehouses, beside dying fires and during stolen hours in the fields. These were not the acts of savages. These were eruptions, carefully built under pressure for generations. And when they exploded, they did not aim wildly. They struck with focus and fury. A manor house set ablaze wasn't only the destruction of timber and stone. It was the symbolic collapse of the idea that suffering was eternal. When rebels forced the lord of that manor to clean the boots of a former serf, they weren't merely humiliating him. They were reversing centuries of ritualized degradation. They were showing, without words, that the world could be different, that the script of their lives could be rewritten, line by painful line. The same fires that lit up estates also burned scrolls and records. Contracts of bondage, tax rolls, fines, debts, gone in curls of ash. These weren't bureaucratic acts. They were sacred rituals of erasure. The peasants were not just burning paper. They were burning evidence of lies, of chains written in ink. They were wiping the slate clean not only for themselves, but for those yet to be born. Inhale, let the image settle. Picture the dark sky above a glowing horizon, the soft orange flicker of rebellion reflecting in the eyes of the oppressed. Imagine the scent of smoke mixing with fresh earth. Hear the crackling timbers. Feel the trembling of history as it shifts beneath your feet. And in this unfolding theater of defiance, the performances grew bolder. priests who had once preached obedience were made to recite new prayers, prayers that praised justice, that named equality as holy. Nobles who had taken daughters and land without consent now begged in front of crowds they once would not have noticed. Some were spared. Some were not. But all were made to see the world as the peasants had seen it, from below. This wasn't just punishment. It was revelation. And it spread. From one hamlet to the next, from one border to the next, the news traveled faster than any army. There were no radios. No bulletins. Only voices. Only memory. But memory is a powerful courier, especially when fed by hope. The ruling class responded with horror. Not because they misunderstood the threat, but because they understood it all too well. They knew their control had never been built on brute force alone. It had been built on a shared myth that they were chosen. That their blood was different. That their right to rule came from the heavens themselves. And now, the myth had torn. And once a myth tears, it cannot be stitched together again without the seams showing. So the rulers panicked. They dispatched soldiers, sent out declarations, tried to contain the revolt with a language of threats and decrees. But ink on a scroll could not undo what fire had already revealed. And soldiers, once feared, once trusted, were often hesitant to raise their blades against neighbors who now stood taller than ever before. Some lords attempted a new tactic, mercy. But even this was laced with desperation. Promises were made. Debts forgiven. Bread handed out in the square. But the peasants had seen too much. They had heard the screaming. Smelled the burning. Held power in their calloused hands and watched it tremble before them. They could not unsee what had been revealed. And the nobles could not unknow that their thrones stood now on shaking ground. Breathe again, slow, full, unhurried. Let the image of a fading fire settle in your mind, not as an end, but as a beginning. Let the warmth of that imagined blaze soothe you. Let the stillness of ashes tell their story. The revolts would not last forever. They never did. Armies would return. Leaders would be executed. Villages punished. But something had already shifted. A veil had been lifted. A curtain drawn back. The performance of feudalism had been exposed, and even the silence that followed could not erase what had been shown. The dream of obedience had been broken, and in its place, the first fragile dreams of freedom had begun. They came in the dead of night, the royal armies, grim-faced, armored, and unrelenting. Where flames had flickered with hope, boots now stamped out embers beneath iron heels. And yet, those embers smoldered in more than just ash. They lived on in the minds of those who had tasted what it meant to resist. The soldiers didn't speak as they passed the charred remains of manor houses, nor did they linger in the squares where peasants once mocked their lords. They had been sent not only to restore order, but to restore fear. Yet even fear seemed thinner now, less certain in its power. Breathe in, slow and deep, and breathe out. Let the weight of centuries lift slightly from your chest. Imagine yourself not as a soldier or rebel, but as a quiet observer standing on the edge of the forest, watching history turn its page in silence. The reprisals were brutal. Those who had dared to rise were hunted down, tried without mercy, executed in front of their neighbors. Heads were placed on pikes at crossroads. Villages were fined, women violated, sons taken for forced labor. The ruling class, rattled by what had nearly slipped through their grasp, reasserted their control with the savagery of desperation. But this time, something was different. The punishments didn't restore order, they merely painted over the cracks. Because something had changed that could not be undone. A seed had been planted, not just in the countryside, but in the very consciousness of the people. The idea, impossible just a generation before, that power could be challenged, that the hierarchy of birth was not divine but fabricated, had now taken root. The rulers tried to deny it, but they too could not unsee what had been revealed. The trembling in their voices as they issued new decrees, the widening eyes behind castle windows, these were the signs of a myth unraveling. And while many rebels died, their ideas did not. The survivors carried stories like torches. Stories of lords brought low. Of priests made to confess to commoners. Of children watching their fathers not bow, but stand tall. These tales became whispers, then songs, then legends. And legends, even those born in pain, have a way of becoming maps for the future. What terrified the ruling class most wasn't the loss of land or wealth, but the loss of certainty. Once, a noble could walk among his serfs without fear. Once, a priest could preach submission without doubt. But now, every bowed head might be hiding defiance. Every silence might be storing rage. And so, repression became routine. Laws were passed to keep peasants from gathering in numbers. New taxes were imposed to fund surveillance. Sermons were written with sharper tones. But all these efforts rang hollow. The lords were no longer gods. They were merely men, and men could be overthrown. As you breathe now, inhale the stillness of twilight. Feel the cool wind of change drift across your skin, even if only in imagination. Watch it rustle the grass growing over forgotten graves, not graves of defeat, but of transformation. For even in death, those who had risen left behind a new rhythm in the world. A different kind of heartbeat. One that whispered, "We can rise again." And they would. Decades later, in far-off towns and foreign fields, new uprisings would begin. Inspired not by nobles or priests, but by the memory of that earlier courage. By the understanding that power only holds as long as belief sustains it. That the moment you stop believing in your inferiority, it begins to fade. This was the true legacy of the revolts. Not destruction, but awakening. And as you drift deeper into sleep or into thought, let that idea rest beside you like a candle, small, quiet, but warm. Let the voices of the past not shout, but murmur. Let the story wrap around you like a soft blanket, woven not with thread, but with remembrance. Because stories like these are not merely history. They are echoes of something larger. Of the human need to be seen, to be valued, to belong. And though those peasants lived and died centuries ago, their courage lives still. In you. In every act of quiet resistance. In every whisper that says, "This is not how it has to be." So close your eyes again. Watch the blank canvas behind your eyelids. And breathe. Not with fear. Not with sorrow. But with calm. With memory. With the knowledge that even the smallest voice can shake an empire when it finally chooses to speak. The years passed, and though the flames of open revolt dimmed, the heat beneath the surface never truly cooled. Villages rebuilt. Fields were tilled once more. Children were born into a world that looked unchanged, yet carried the faintest tremble beneath its soil, like footsteps still echoing long after the march. The lords returned to their halls. The clergy resumed their chants. But neither sounded as convincing as before. The peasants obeyed, yes, but there was something in their eyes now, a flicker, a knowledge. They had seen behind the curtain. Take a slow breath in and let it out gently. Allow your shoulders to sink, your chest to soften. Let your thoughts drift like dust in the fading light. Picture the quiet countryside, the same hills and forests, but with new stories buried beneath the roots. Not forgotten, just resting. What the ruling class failed to understand was this: while they had crushed the body of the revolt, they had awakened its mind. The rebellions had not been aimless rage. They had been precise expressions of long-suppressed truth. The very violence used to reclaim dignity became a kind of map, one scrawled in pain, but clear and unforgettable. And in the decades that followed, others would walk that map. Sometimes cautiously, sometimes boldly, but always forward. It wasn't just the poor who changed. Something shifted in the hearts of the powerful too. They grew more guarded, more suspicious. The easy confidence of birthright began to harden into paranoia. New laws, more brutal than before, were passed, not because the nobles were strong, but because they were afraid. They feared the memory of what had happened. They feared its return. And it did return, not always in fire, not always in blood, but in thought. In questions. In quiet refusals. In subtle shifts of behavior. A man who once bowed without being told now waited to be asked. A young woman declined a nobleman's gaze without apology. A community withheld their harvest when the taxmen came early. Tiny acts. But together, they formed a tide. The church, once unchallenged, now faced whispers. Priests looked upon their congregations and sensed distance. The sermons felt thinner, the rituals less binding. Faith had not died, but it had been separated from obedience. And that distinction was revolutionary. As you breathe now, deeper and more slowly, imagine a candle glowing in the darkened nave of a village chapel. It flickers, steady but alive. Around it, shadows of old icons and worn pews stretch long across stone. Outside, beyond the walls, peasants sit by fires, passing down tales to children, not of kings and saints, but of people like themselves. Of farmers who stood. Of mothers who refused. Of boys who shouted truth into the face of power. These stories, whispered from parent to child, became the quiet fuel of a new age. And while most peasants returned to their lives, they were no longer the same lives. Their work was still hard, their burdens still many. But beneath every task lay a foundation of self-awareness. They had discovered that their suffering was not divinely decreed. That their silence was not fate. That they were not lesser. That knowledge could not be buried. And so, over time, it shaped the world in ways neither sword nor scripture could fully undo. Trade began to shift. Local alliances formed between towns and farmers. Literate rebels, once rare, became mentors. Education spread, not with permission, but through secret gatherings and quiet determination. And every time a child learned to read, the revolt continued. It was not a battle anymore. It was a slow, deliberate erosion of the old world. Breathe again. Let that breath carry the weight of all those who came before. Let your body rest as though it were soil, fertile, ready, patient. Let your imagination drift to the edges of a village once scorched and now green again. Life moves forward, but memory remains. And in that memory, transformation grows. Because change, like nature, never truly stops. Even when it sleeps, it dreams. And the dreams of the oppressed are rarely forgotten. They echo through generations, sometimes in silence, sometimes in storm. But always there. Always waiting. So as you close your eyes again, deeper now, heavier now, know that you're resting not only with this story, but with all the stories it birthed. Each one a gentle rebellion. Each one a breath against the weight of history. And the breathing continues. The rebellion may have ended in blood, but its aftershocks continued to ripple beneath the quiet surface of daily life. In fields that once bore the footprints of marching peasants, wheat now swayed again with the wind. Cows were milked. Bread was baked. But in the hearts of those who had seen the veil lifted, the world had changed forever. The weight of centuries had cracked, not completely, but enough to let light in. And it was in that light, faint as it was, that new generations learned to see the world differently. Inhale gently now, deep and calm, and exhale through soft lips. Allow your thoughts to drift like fallen leaves across the still waters of memory. You're safe here. Let your breath slow. Let your limbs grow heavier. Let the voices of those long gone rise gently, like whispers through the trees. In time, some of the nobility adapted. They became quieter, more cautious. Others hardened, clinging to their dwindling power like men clutching gold in a sinking ship. But the world was shifting beneath their feet. The peasants had changed. The silence they returned to was not the same as before. It was laced with knowing. They followed rules, yes, but no longer believed in them. They bowed, but not in reverence. They worked, but now with eyes open. The memory of revolt had become a presence in every village. An invisible figure seated at every meal. A quiet reminder that change was possible, that fear could be unlearned. The lords tried to distract their subjects with festivals and sermons, with proclamations and punishments. But they could not erase the stories being passed in whispers, stories of how the mighty were made to kneel, how scrolls were burned, how for one brief, impossible season, the world had turned upside down. And in the stillness of night, as fires dwindled and children listened with wide eyes, those stories sank deep into the soil of their souls. The greatest weapon of the rebellion had not been blade or flame. It had been imagination, the imagining of a different life. A better world. One where suffering was not a birthright and silence was not a virtue. And once awakened, that imagination could never be fully put back to sleep. Villagers began to think more critically. They questioned the priest's sermons more openly, wondering how divine love could coexist with such earthly cruelty. They tracked grain stores more closely, recalling how famine had been used as punishment. They noticed the gap between the opulence of their lords and the hunger of their neighbors, and they began, slowly, to speak about it. And even though they no longer carried torches, their words sparked embers. These embers glowed quietly in taverns, in corners of fields, in marketplaces. They were passed with bread, with wine, with song. Women wove them into lullabies. Elders folded them into warnings. And every whisper was a thread in a tapestry of awakening, woven slowly but tightly. Take another deep breath now. Feel the gentle rhythm of your body, steady, soft, slow. You are not in a hurry. Let your mind walk barefoot across old cobbled streets, past shutters half closed against the wind. hear laughter, real, weary, but free. It echoes from the past like a lullaby, because laughter returned too, in time. Not the forced laughter of submission, but the soft kind, the laughter of people who know they've endured, who've survived the storm. The rebellion did not free them fully, but it changed how they bore their chains. It made them heavier to the lords, lighter to the peasants. Because they had seen them, the chains, for what they truly were, forged by custom, not by fate. And perhaps most importantly, they had seen themselves. The image of a peasant dragging a noble from a saddle, of a woman standing firm while a steward begged, of a child watching his father rise instead of kneel, these were visions that could not be unremembered. They became stories not of shame, but of power. And from these stories, a new kind of dignity emerged, quiet, enduring, and steady as breath. Yes, many revolts had failed. Yes, the system endured. But something sacred had broken free from the silence. A crack in the old stone. A question in every obedient gesture. A weight behind every glance. And through it all, the breathing continued. Soft, steady, and strong. So now, as your own breath flows gently in and out, feel the layers of time peel back. Know that you are connected not only to the victors of history, but to those who resisted, who questioned, who whispered. Their courage may not be carved in stone, but it is written in wind and blood and story. And tonight, as you drift toward rest, you carry those stories with you. Not as burdens, but as reminders. Of what can awaken in the quiet. Of what strength lies in endurance. Of how the smallest spark, a question, a word, a breath, can begin a fire that will someday change the world. Rest now. Let it all fade to black behind your eyelids. Let the echoes quiet. Let the heartbeat of the earth lull you deeper. You are safe. You are still. You are part of something long and eternal, the quiet dream of justice, always breathing. And in the slow rhythm of seasons passing, in the gentle cycle of planting and harvest, the memory of revolt settled like dust in every corner of peasant life. It did not roar any longer. It did not scream. But it lingered, like smoke from a fire long extinguished, like the faint scent of something once burned deeply into the walls of an old house. Even as life resumed its shape, the shadow of what had happened never fully left. And it didn't need to. For what had changed was not just law or order, but belief. Take a long breath in and a soft breath out. Let your mind grow still as a forgotten field beneath the stars. Let every thought stretch out and loosen. Let your awareness grow light and wide, as though drifting above an old landscape, quiet and breathing beneath you. There were still rulers. Still taxes. Still sermons echoing down stone aisles. But there was no going back to the old certainty. The kind that had once kept peasants bowed with unquestioned submission. That certainty had cracked. And in its place, something far more dangerous had begun to grow, the habit of questioning. The taste of possibility. The quiet strength of shared memory. In distant towns and scattered regions, new ideas began to take root, not all at once, and not always with clarity. But always with intent. Minor rebellions broke out here and there. Not vast enough to make the annals of kings, but real enough to make magistrates nervous and priests preach louder. A barn refused. A landlord's grain mysteriously spoiled. An edict ignored. They were small acts, but they multiplied. And still, the peasants told stories. They told them by firelight, with the smell of smoke in their hair and dirt beneath their nails. They spoke not just of what had happened, but of how it had felt to be seen, to be feared, to be free, if only for a flicker of time. Those moments, short-lived though they were, became the seeds of something far bigger than any single revolt. They became the fuel for thought itself. And from thought came speech. From speech, planning. And from planning, the slow churning wheel of change. The nobility sensed this, and it frightened them. So they turned increasingly to spectacle, processions, banners, royal decrees, all meant to dazzle, to distract, to restore the illusion of invulnerability. But illusions are delicate things. Once they've cracked, they shimmer oddly in the light. And even a child could see that behind the jewels and titles, there were only people. Frightened, aging, uncertain people whose rule depended not on divine right, but on continued belief. And belief was thinning. Even the clergy, once so firm in their proclamations of order and submission, began to fracture. A few brave souls began to speak more gently. Others fled entirely, unable to reconcile scripture with suffering. In some corners of the world, rogue preachers offered new interpretations of old truths. They spoke of dignity, of common grace, of a kingdom not ruled from a throne but built in hearts. And the people listened. Breathe slowly now, feel the warmth of those words, like soft wool over your shoulders. You are wrapped in story, not to weigh you down, but to let you rest more deeply. Let the sounds of the world grow distant, like a village falling asleep under the moon. It was in this hush that something powerful began to unfold. A transformation not of laws, but of mind. The peasants, those who had lived and died for centuries in silence, had discovered a new kind of voice. It wasn't always spoken aloud. Sometimes it lived only in the eyes or in the stillness before a refusal. But it was there. Present. Rooted. Waiting. This was how real change always begins, not with banners or swords, but with an unspoken agreement, slowly forming across thousands of unseen lives. The agreement that things can be different. That the past is not prophecy. That power must answer not only to tradition, but to justice. And so, even in the years when no revolts burned, when the fields lay peaceful and the records show no disruption, the real work continued. Quietly. Patiently. Like roots beneath stone. The children of those who had risen grew up hearing about that time when lords were made to kneel, when the lowest stood tallest. They inherited not only the land, but the dream. And they carried it forward in 1,000 small, almost invisible ways. A midwife who treated every patient, noble or not, with the same firm kindness. A teacher who taught a laborer's son to write. A tradesman who refused to overcharge the desperate. These were not soldiers, but they were rebels just the same. Because rebellion is not always an explosion. Sometimes it is a quiet insistence on decency. A refusal to bow again. A commitment to truth, passed from hand to hand like bread. And through it all, the breathing continued. The wind in the trees. The breath of oxen at dawn. The slow, deep rhythm of generations becoming something more. Let yourself feel that rhythm now, steady, soft, like your own breath, rising and falling, as your body rests heavier, as your thoughts loosen, as your heart listens. Because history is not just the memory of the powerful. It is the whisper of the many, those who endured, who hoped, who passed down quiet courage through stories like this one. You carry those whispers now. And in your rest, in your stillness, in your breath, you keep them alive. So let yourself drift. Let the dust of time settle. Let the embers glow soft and safe behind your eyes. And we will continue. And as the decades ripened into centuries, the revolt itself became less a memory of fire and more a myth made of breath, repeated in countless voices across countless homes, until it no longer mattered if the details were precise. The truth of it lived not in facts, but in feeling. In the knowledge that once, the earth had shaken, and it had not been the lords or kings who caused it, but the humble, the quiet, the long-forgotten. That memory became a kind of lantern carried through generations who walked in shadow, lighting the path forward in the darkest hours. Draw in a long, gentle breath and let it go slowly. Let your mind float like candle smoke in a draftless room. You are not thinking now. You are remembering, not from your own life, but from a place much deeper, a place beneath words, where the oldest truths sleep. The rulers wrote their histories, of course. They recorded dates and names, punishments and proclamations. They praised the return of order, the justice of the crown, the reassertion of divine right. But even as they wrote, they sensed what their scrolls could never silence, that something had slipped beyond their grasp. That though the villages bowed again, the belief had not returned. That though the land looked the same, something beneath it had shifted irreversibly. And it had. For the most lasting victories are often invisible. A heart no longer willing to kneel. A mind that questions. A child taught to ask why. Even in peaceful seasons, those changes echoed. A reeve who spared a tax. A tenant who demanded fair grain weight. A congregation that questioned the bishop's wealth. These weren't revolts, not in name. But they were continuations. The rebellion had simply changed shape. And as the world moved forward, it did so under the weight of that memory. New ideas began to circulate slowly, at first, like distant thunder. Words like rights, liberty, conscience began to appear in places once only reserved for kings and scholars. And when these ideas came, they found fertile ground in the souls of peasants whose ancestors had already dreamed such things without the words to name them. Revolutions would come again, in time. In other places. In other tongues. But always with echoes of that first cry, that the order of the world is not fixed, that the powerful are not sacred, that justice is not the birthright of a few. And always, beneath those movements, the breath of those who came before. They had not known they were beginning something so vast. They had simply stood where they could no longer sit. Spoken where silence had become unbearable. Acted where inaction meant the death of dignity. But in doing so, they had created a tremor that would roll through time itself, touching even you now, in this quiet moment. So rest your thoughts. Let go. Feel the air around you, still, safe, unhurried. Imagine it as the breath of generations, circling gently around your resting form. No one watches. No one judges. There is only breath, and story, and silence. Even in defeat, the rebels had won something profound. They had pierced the illusion that power was eternal. They had shown that no throne sits on stone, only on belief. And belief, once cracked, never hardens the same way again. The lords built higher walls after that. But they could never build them high enough to block out memory. The peasants planted fields again, but they planted, too, the seeds of possibility. A world passed on, one whisper at a time. And in time, the lords passed on. their names forgotten by the common man, their wealth scattered or squandered, their power broken and reshaped by tides of change they could not control. But the story of the revolt, endured. Not as a lesson in violence, but as a lesson in becoming. In the strength of those who rise not for glory, but for the quiet, aching dignity of their lives. So breathe again, deep and soft. Let the image fade. Let the village sleep beneath its pale moon. Let the old fields lie still. Let the people rest, their work done. Let the past return to the soil. And you return to stillness, to breath, to the quiet knowing that you are part of a story older and braver than even history dares to record. A story written not with ink, but with courage. Not by the few, but by the many. Let it rock you now, like the lull of wind through open windows. Let it settle in your chest like warmth beside a hearth. You do not need to remember it all, only to feel it. And we will continue. The seasons turned, and as each harvest rose and fell, the revolt passed from living memory into the quiet space where legends dwell. Not forgotten, never that, but softened. The edges blurred by time, the fury mellowed into parable. And yet, at its heart, the story remained whole. A tale not of kings or castles, but of ordinary hands that once reached skyward and refused to be lowered. A story whispered from one soul to the next, that a new world had been glimpsed, if only for a moment, and that glimpse had changed everything. Now breathe gently, slowly, as though your body is floating in still water. As you breathe out, feel your limbs grow heavy and quiet. Watch the blank canvas behind your eyelids and allow imagination to carry you, weightless, into the heart of that legacy. In the villages, no monuments stood for the peasants who rose. No statues honored them, no songs were sung in courtly halls. But their names lived on in smaller, truer ways, in the defiance of a grandmother's eyes, in the careful pride of a mason's craft, in the reverence with which an elder taught a child to read. In these quiet acts of resistance, the spirit of the revolt endured. And it endured not because it was remembered in words, but because it had transformed the way people understood themselves. No longer were they simply tools in someone else's design. They had become bearers of their own meaning, authors of their own futures, however limited, however fragile. And though the wheels of oppression turned on, they no longer turned unchallenged. The peasants knew now that obedience could be broken, that fear could be overcome, that dignity was not a gift from the crown but something already inside them, waiting to be claimed. This, more than anything, was what frightened the powerful. Because the system they clung to, of estates and lineage, of sword and seal and sermon, had never been built on strength alone. It had been built on belief. Belief in the naturalness of inequality. Belief in the permanence of the throne. Belief in silence as virtue. And now, that belief had been pierced. It did not collapse all at once. History never does. But it began to fray. At the edges, first, in strange places, with unlikely people. A young friar preaching equality from a candlelit chapel. A merchant refusing to pay tribute to a corrupt lord. A group of villagers demanding to choose their own reeve. Each small. Each easily overlooked. But together, like drops of water carving stone, they wore away at the old world. The revolts had not been in vain. They had given birth to a new kind of courage. A quieter kind, yes, less fiery than torches and blades, but no less enduring. the courage to speak truth at the wrong time, to teach what was forbidden, to love what had been deemed unworthy, to remember. Breathe again, and as you do, feel the hush of time settle around you. Let your body relax into the memory of all those who came before you. Their struggles are not weight upon you, but warmth. Their dreams are not burdens, but soft winds at your back. Because dreams do not die with those who dream them. They pass on, subtly, like pollen through the air. And even now, you carry some part of that dream within you, the dream of a world shaped not by power, but by care. Not by command, but by consent. Not by bloodline, but by shared breath. And this is the true story, the one you were never taught. That power can be temporary, but awakening cannot. That kings may write the laws, but people write the future. That the most radical act is sometimes to simply see yourself as worthy. And that when enough people do so, across miles, across borders, across centuries, empires begin to tremble. So as your eyes grow heavier and the world around you softens into quiet, let this knowledge rest with you. Let it hum in your breath, steady and sure. Let it glow behind your eyes like coals waiting for kindling. You are not alone. You are part of a story that never ends. And as the final echoes of rebellion fade into the soil, what remains is not the fire, but the warmth. What remains is not the cry, but the breath that followed. What remains is you. Breathing. Believing. Becoming. And now, rest.